702.
You're listening to the best of The Money Show.
The Money Show.
It's just after 7. Welcome to the best bits of The Money Show. This is a digest of just some of the best interviews from the show this week. If you'd like to hear more, you know what to do. Go to our website or your favorite podcast app and just search The Money Show. Listen, give us a rating. Always a good one. 5-star here with us. Or share with your colleagues and friends. Well, to start off with, here are some of the news stories that piqued our interest here on The Money Show from the week that was. The Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee, I wasn't too happy about this, voting to keep the repo rate unchanged at 7%. The prime lending rate remains at 10.5%. So very little relief for us as consumers and households. Then the Federal Reserve cutting U.S. interest rates for the first time this year, since December, in fact. So it was way before Donald Trump even became a president. Of course, the White House has been pushing for the U.S. Fed to cut more interest rates as U.S. job numbers go even lower. Earlier in the week, another data point coming out from South Africa. Stats says annual consumer price inflation pulling back in August, easing to 3.3% from 3.5% in July. Thanks to softer food and fuel inflation taking some of the heat off the headline rate. I think the more or rather the less we have to pay for food, the better. And you know how I feel about that petrol price. Then tonight, we'll bring you a mix of stories from the world of money from the week that has been. Earlier in the week on personal finance, John Manyike, head of financial education at Old Mutual, joined us to delve into the significance of customary marriages within the South African heritage. He unpacked the financial and legal implications, shedding light on how these traditional unions impact everything from asset ownership to estate planning. Let's take a listen.
So look, I wish there was a very straightforward answer to that question. Is lobola alone enough, or does it constitute marriage enough? Because we also have to consider what the case law in the country means. But in principle, if you look at the law which governs customary marriage, which is Recognition of Customary Law Act, it does stipulate that a customary marriage must be, and basically it must meet 3 requirements. One, the first one is that the couple must both consent or have an intention to enter into a customary marriage. And secondly, they must be of age, at least 18 years and above. And lastly, that it must be negotiated and entered into in accordance with customary law. This is where the bone of contention is in most cases. That involves the testing of the legality of the lobola or the marriage itself. Now, in principle, one can easily argue and say, well, we have not celebrated. Yes, we paid lobola, but we have not celebrated. But we've seen over the years case law that says, well, at least some form of celebration should have
occurred.
What
constitutes a celebration in that particular point? Because when Mathidis had the uncles at the gate, they come in with gifts and sometimes ivulamlo or more, a bit of money and a good bottle of whiskey. Festivities have started, basically. The lobolas then are put on the table. If the two parties agree, then they shake hands. The marriage is ongoing. Would there need to be ululations for the celebration, playing of music? What constitutes a celebration?
That's the thing, because the law does not explicitly give details, because of the lawmakers had to recognize the fact that in South Africa, we've got different cultures, we've got different ethnic groups. Even within one family, you can have a diversity of clans. There's certain practices that are observed in one clan and not the other. So they didn't want to get themselves too involved with the detail. Now, unfortunately, that has been left to the courts, where they hear arguments from parties that say, no, but you didn't, there was no ululation, the bride was not handed over officially. But then what I've picked up is that the courts have been more lenient, especially in favor of women, because they are the ones who are mostly disadvantaged, where men will live with a woman for 10 years and then come back later and say, no, but I want out, and then they want to go and marry someone. Now, the debates have to happen in court, where one party has to prove that no, but we did conclude a customary marriage.
Yeah.
So I always advise people to consult the legal practitioners, but you need to err on the side of caution when it comes to trying to wage a debate that you're not married simply because your argument is that there was no handing over. Remember the case of WHP that was in the news a couple of years ago?
Yes.
I think you'll recall that. One of the arguments was no marain, man. There was no handing over of the bride. But then the court would say, but hang on a sec, but were you not calling her Makot? In other words, you were behaving like a husband and wife. You're calling each other a wife. Why all of a sudden you say she's not your wife, but that's how you're addressing each other. That's how you're addressing yourself as Makoti, my wife, my husband. So obviously, anything that constitutes evidence, the court will be interested in hearing that.
During Lobola, there are those books and notebooks that people keep record of what's happened, who was part of the Lobola negotiations, what was decided, when is the marriage date going to be. Can those also be filed in court as evidence?
No, absolutely. Motheo, people would even go to as far as they're using their Instagram pictures to demonstrate that, well, this was a celebration. If this is not a celebration, tell us what it is. So all forms of possible evidence can be presented before court. So it's too risky to go that way. This is why it's very important to register a customary marriage with Home Affairs, at least within 3 months from concluding the process, because then you eliminate all this drama.
And then here's a point I also want to get to. There's a lot of cohabitation in South Africa, aka fat and set, right? How long would I have to stay with someone for that to turn into a marriage?
Well, at this point in time, one cannot argue that, by living with someone, it will not necessarily convert the status of that relationship into a marriage, regardless of how many years you've lived together. What does happen, though, is that it can pivot itself to what we call a universal partnership. A universal partnership where you've lived together for a reasonably long time, could be 6 months or more, and consistently, again, behaving like life partners, where you are exchanging or where you share responsibilities and so on. In the event that ultimately at some point that relationship dissolves, now the question is that you've been accumulating assets over the period that you've been living together. How do you then split that? So in such cases where matters are debated in court, they will look at those things. I read one particular case law where the court went as far as saying, 30% of the man's assets should be liquidated in favor of the woman. So it's not a foregone conclusion. Just because it's not regarded as marriage doesn't mean there shouldn't be fairness in terms of how assets or even liabilities, for that matter, could be dealt with properly and in a just manner.
Let's get then into the marriage process. For instance, when I was getting married, I chatted to a lawyer friend of mine, and he was like, "Look, chap, before you go the lobola route, make sure you have the contract in place, whichever one you want to have for your union." And mine was out of community of property, right? And he was like, if you pay lobola before, then you automatically go into another regime that would leave you in a joint estate, which would be community of property. Can you just clarify the process there? What comes first?
Ideally, if you want to use the matrimonial property system out of community of property, ideally you would want to conclude that process where you sign an antenuptial contract before the lobola negotiations. Even though one can argue and say that at a technical level, if you have not celebrated, but it's a long shot and a very risky one. Some lawyers would say, well, if you are in the process, because sometimes you find the couple is pressed for time because they want to conclude this, they don't want to be living together without being married, and because they want to observe other could be religious beliefs and things like that, and they want to respect their parents, they want to do that. In some instances, the lawyers will but say, okay, at least let's sign a letter that states that you have no intention of concluding a customary marriage. But then when you do that, you start meddling the waters, because, sometimes with these things, you can say you are you are aligned with your partner, but when things turn sour, your partner can show you flames.
So, look, hear me well, right? I'm not saying, John, that it's a trap, but hear me well. Once you get into community of property, right, what are the costs of trying to get out of the contract and starting over and maybe getting an ANC?
Well, if you've already concluded a marriage, and which amounts to in community of property, because you didn't have a prenup, and all of a sudden there's change of circumstances, whatever the circumstances may be, you do have alternatives. One, of course, is to divorce and remarry. The other one is, of course, there is a legal process which is quite tedious to actually change that. But because remember, also your creditors need to be informed that this is what's going to happen, so that if there are liabilities from parties, then they know how to deal with it. It's quite a tedious process, but it is certainly an option that exists for couples who want to do that.
So you need to pay lawyers to get out of that initial union you were in so that you can get into an antenuptial contract.
That's right.
Then let's look at the customary marriages then. It means you are in a joint estate, joint at the hip, and maybe also joint in terms of your accounts financially. Just explain the implications of that regime.
So if you're married in community of property, it means you have a joint estate. You have to share the assets and liabilities. Here we're talking about any assets or liabilities that you acquired before or during the marriage. You both share that. Of course, the couple will share the responsibility in terms of liabilities, even during the marriage, where it doesn't matter who initiated the debts, because sometimes you find that somebody going to apply for a loan and whatever they state in their forms, because some of these, in the case of customary marriages that are not registered with Home Affairs, there's no way that a bank or a financial institution will be aware that you are married, because there's no record of it. But that notwithstanding, if your partner goes and incur loans of 300,000 or so forth and so on, you are equally liable for that, because your partner will have signed. Wow. Same with businesses. I mean, you're in business. Maybe your partner started the business. You've acquired the business, or you acquired the business during the marriage. It's considered to be a joint venture. Both spouses have an equal share in the business and will be entitled to an equal share of the profits or losses of that business.
Oh, losses, which is the major point.
Yes. And I'm glad you're highlighting that, because sometimes people get excited and say, I'm going to divorce, and then all of a sudden you realize your partner has ramped up this insurmountable debt, that if you want to divorce, then you realize that you're going to be owing millions. I mean, especially if they were in business.
That was John Manyike, who helped us unpack the cultural, financial, and legal dimensions of customary marriages in South Africa.
702. You are listening to The Money Show's best bits.
On our Business Unusual feature this week, Graeme Codrington, lead researcher at the Tomorrow Today Futures Institute, joined the conversation to unpack the University of Cape Town's groundbreaking decision to allow artificial intelligence in student assignments. The discussion explored whether this move marked the beginning of the end for traditional learning methods or represented a bold leap into the future of education.
I think this is a very interesting conversation, not just for universities, but also for any business that includes both professionals and people who are using their brain power, so-called knowledge workers. It's coming up to nearly 3 years anniversary since generative AI was introduced. And I actually think it's quite impressive that UCT is one of the first universities in the world to just say, you know what, if you're going to use generative AI, use it. But your question is quite right. I think I'm a bit older than you, Motheo, and anybody who's older than 50, maybe I can help you to not be that grumpy old person looking at today's young people strangely, because those of us who went to school in the 1980s, we will remember the introduction of calculators for the matric maths exam. And I was matriculated in 1988, and I remember that my grandfather, who was an inspector of education, thought that it was going to be the end of the world. He was one of those guys who could do amazing mental mathematics, and he thought that our generation of young people in the 1980s and 90s having calculators would mean that we wouldn't understand the basics of trigonometry and calculus, that we wouldn't know how to even do 2 + 2 in our heads. And maybe he was right. We've all got calculators on our computers, and I know that these days I check whether the tip I've added is correctly added up on the restaurant bill before I put the total. I check it on the calculator, not in my head. But what actually happened, Motheo, over the years is not what my grandfather was expecting. Instead of us dumbing everybody down, what's actually happened in the last 30 years or so is we've raised the base. So now the mathematics that young people are learning in matric today is probably similar to what my generation was learning in first year varsity. So calculators allowed us to not dumb down the clever kids, but actually raise the base of everybody else. And that meant we could teach higher level maths, and it did mean that the teachers had to change. And maybe that's the point of my story this evening, is that when you know that your students have access to a piece of technology that can give them some of the answers, you do have to change the questions, and you have to change the way that you question them. And I think that's what UCT are challenging their lecturers to do. And I think there will be a ripple into the professional world as well.
I mean, I remember exams where you were handed another extra piece of paper to try and work out the sums. Then we got to, maths higher grade, and then you were handed the calculator. Couldn't believe your life, but maths was still tough, even with the calculator in hand. Now, looking at, how education would be shaped going forward using generative AI, I think, is it a matter of people not understanding the technology and maybe trying to fend off something they don't understand instead of just welcoming it in terms of enhancing education going forward?
That's a great question, Motheo, and this is really why I thought this topic might be interesting for the Business Unusual slot this week, because contrast to UCT, just last week, I was with one of the big consulting companies, working with them and talking to them about AI. And they've got great AI tools that they've developed, and they're looking at agentic AI and all these good things into the future. But the one big question that didn't seem to have an answer was, how do we train the junior staff? Again, apologies, this is supposed to be a future-focused segment. I'm going into history this evening. But after school and studies, I went to KPMG, and I did articles at KPMG. And those first 2 years of articles, to be honest, for a guy who had a BCom and was kind of pretty smart, it really didn't feel like I was stretching myself, doing creditors recons and bank recons and stock counts and so on. But the point of those first 2 or 3 years in your profession, whether it's accounting or auditing or legal or engineering, the point of it is you learn the basics of your profession. You learn those building blocks that then help you to become that top quality professional later in your career. Now, what if we don't ever need a human being to do those basics? Because that's what these big consulting companies and legal and engineering and auditing companies are doing. They're saying whatever a first-year clerk or a second-year clerk used to do, we can get the machine to do that. And I think that's right. But here's where I think we've got to have a conversation. is if you don't have the basic building blocks, if you've let a machine do your thinking for you, and then you hit something which is unusual or different or requires an application of skills, you might not have enough basic building blocks to be able to come up with a new idea. So that's a long way around to answer your excellent question. But I think we've got to still find a balance. Find a balance of using the new technology and tools that are available, but also realizing we can't outsource proper professional thinking to machines. And I'm not quite sure we know where the balance is between those two things at the moment.
I understand the scrapping of AI detectors, but I would be swayed to at least have university students show maybe their prompts, how they got to that idea, the brainstorming of the particular assignments that they need to complete as part of the attachments to the assignment, just to see how the AI is being used. I think it will be also a great help to see how, from a lecturer's point of view, how the students are still using the AI to think for themselves.
Yeah, and one final story from history. So when I was doing tax at WITS in the 1990s, we convinced our lecturers to make it an open book exam. And just like you experienced, Motheo, when you were handed the calculator, at first you think, oh, wow, this is amazing. I've got access to the Tax Act while I'm sitting in the exam. What you didn't realize is that your teachers were ahead of you. They raised the game, making the assignments and the questions harder. Because if you've got access to the underlying data or the underlying knowledge, the real question is, can you apply it? And that's, I think, the secret here, Motheo, is that in the university, we've got to change the questions we ask. We can't ask somebody to do a book summary anymore. We can't ask somebody to give us the 3 reasons that the Second World War started, because they can just ask ChatGPT to give them that answer. Now we need application. And that's what I'm excited to see. I'm excited to see better questions requiring deeper insight that can't be replicated by the machine. And in the professional world, I'm excited not to see the power of ChatGPT to replace anybody in businesses, but rather to augment their skills. For me, the best use of generative AI is to take somebody who is already good at what they do and give them a little bit of an extra edge. To go back to what I said about the calculator, we're not trying to dumb down the clever people. We're trying to raise the base for everybody so that everybody can be clever, and the really clever people can be even cleverer when they use technology in addition to their own brain. So for me, it's both and, rather either or.
That was Business Unusual with Graeme Codrington, reflecting on UCT's decision to embrace AI in academic work, whether it signals the decline of traditional learning or bold reimagining of education. One thing is clear: the future of learning is being rewritten in real time.
702. The best of the Money Show from this week.
This week on How I Make My Money, we featured Mandla Sibeko, the visionary entrepreneur who transformed Johannesburg's premier art fair into a fully black-owned platform. Now, since acquiring FNB Art Joburg in 2019, Sibeko reimagined the fair with a bold new vision, one that elevated African contemporary art while championing inclusivity, equal representation, and cultural integrity. Now, under his leadership, the fair evolved into both a thriving marketplace and a global stage for creative voices from across the continent.
Well, I can't quite recollect when was my first artwork, but what I do remember is in those days, I think I was early in business. I think it was just before 2010. I had been in charge of the look and feel for FIFA, for the FIFA stadiums. It was a long process that I had started like 5 years before. And then when I finally had some money after the World Cup, I then wanted to spend it. And one of the things I wanted to do was buy art. So I kind of walked into the FNB Art Joburg fair It was called the FNB Art Joburg Fair at the time. And then, and I was just so completely dazzled by what I saw, that it was such a very fresh, very contemporary, very edgy. It was the kind of stuff that I saw overseas, but had not seen it here at home. So, and that kind of led me to spending more time with artists and getting to understand what art was about, the little that I could know at the time. And then I bought a couple of pieces. It was mostly prints. Yeah, and that really did make me very interested to a point where I actually wanted to actively invest in the art ecosystem.
We'll get to the acquisition a bit later, but I want to talk about your formative years as somebody that got into business. Why the interest in capital investments? Why the interest in that part of the sector in terms of doing business?
Well, I think I kind of recognize the importance of the creative sector. And my philosophy has always been to invest in my passions. So I've landed up investing in things that I'm passionate about, and then art is one of those. And then I also liked that it wasn't kind of like your traditional museum, nonprofit kind of approach. It was a commercial business, that it was actually a business that sells space to galleries, engages with galleries, and brings content to the space. And a lot of people don't quite realize that it is a going business. You do employ people, you do put up this infrastructure, and you do own an infrastructure that you keep that helps you to build quite a big fair once a year.
From outside looking in, and from somebody who's attended some of these art fairs, you can't quite tell where the commercial structure is. It just looks like a lot of artists have come together, put together a lot of their great works, and they've been given a space where they can showcase their work and potentially also get somebody to invest and take it home. But in terms of the commercial viability of this particular investment for you, how does it work? Putting together an art fair and making sure it is profitable.
Yep. Well, it's a year-long process. First and foremost, you need a team of qualified and experienced people who understand the art ecosystem, who speak the language, but also who respect the art ecosystem. So those people you keep the whole year. It varies from a curatorial team to production teams, production management team to marketing teams. And so in essence, in the value chain, you are supporting various people to kind of help you build the fair, including the worker who ultimately comes to the fair to build the wall itself, and to paint and to put up the vinyls. That's another whole process on its own. That's quite an important thing in an art fair. The architectural side, engaging with an architect with a lot of backwards and forth. And then the actual creation of the content itself, which requires you to look for understanding where art content sits at this moment, especially in South Africa and across the continent, because we're a Pan-African fair. So it means that we have to be engaged sometimes without even being in those cities and trying to navigate what does Lagos really look like at this point in time. What are the coolest things that we could bring to Joburg? What are the coolest things that are happening in Ethiopia? Many years ago, we helped to launch the first gallery from Addis Ababa in South Africa that has gone international, is now London-based. That gallery is very focused on the European scene, but doesn't come to Joburg. So we now have to look for the next one. So there are various areas, and then there's the side where you ultimately have built your content and now you're selling space, the square meterage. There's a formula around the fair. There's different sizes. We speak about the hub. The hub is the main section of the fair, where these are galleries that are probably players for more than 20 years. a lot of people go to galleries without seeing that these galleries themselves are actually small businesses. Some of them have become international, like the at the top, the top ones are multi-million businesses, actually. If you look at the ones that have South African galleries, for that matter,
Yeah.
have spaces in London and so on. So there's a lot of various pieces that ultimately come together, and then there's a ticketing side, and then that's where the audiences come in, and by then everything is done. The fair has been built within a schedule that is set aside with perhaps the convention center, where you buy the space from them for a couple of millions, and then you then have to pay them, and then you have to find money to make sure that you do pay your bills.
I like how you say a couple of millions. How do you then value the square meterage of a gallery? Is that you curating some of the big names in art, or is it based on foot traffic like it would be at a mall? How does that work?
Well, we place experience, like we were an 18-year kind of fair. Internationally, the model is that people pay square meterage. It could be like 5 Rand per square meter, depending on the size that you have chosen and that we feel fits you. So you'll never get a gallery that's been around for more than 60 years in the smallest space. So they have to take the bigger space. So then that means that they pay more. And then we've created a new section in the fair, which when we reimagined the fair 5 years ago, we called it Gallery Lab, which is really where we incubate the next future galleries from the continent, because we realize that Joburg and South Africa is quite privileged to have a lot of infrastructure inherited from apartheid in many ways, but the rest of the continent doesn't have what Joburg has. So if you're waiting for that African art ecosystem to build itself, you'll wait a lifetime. So we then thought, let's kind of find a way in which we can shift the sponsorship component, which is the other pillar of the business. Is sponsorship, is that FNB then pays for naming rights. And these naming rights, we then decided that we will use their fund, the finance from FNB, mostly to cover for the build-up of the fair, but also to support future young gallerists. That's why this year we could have like 14 galleries from, 14 countries, which is quite a lot.
From an events perspective, and I'm trying to come up with a way of explaining it to our listener. You know, from an event perspective, at a concert, you'll have the big names that are coming through, whether it's Amapiano artists or whoever is popular at the time. So your El Anatsuis, your Willem Kentridges, Julie Menretu. Do you list those for private clients that know who you're talking about and what the value might be to attend that fair?
Look, another component of an art fair is what we call the VIP program. And this is where all of those big names sit in. So we run privately a VIP program that is really targeted at people who may have been collecting art for a long time. We know them by name. We know what they like. We work together with the galleries on making sure that group of people has access to our VIP program. And that VIP program gives people into it's smaller gatherings that take place during the fair of inspirational experiences that people would ordinarily not have. But also it could be engagements with artists. And and then what has actually started to happen, Motheo, is that when we went just before the fair, the galleries run on a catalog system. So the catalogs get released. And on those catalogs, that's when you'll pick up which artists are actually going to appear at the fair. It's very important that catalogs go out before the fair, because the buyers who buy art at the fair are not only at the fair, they're also outside of the fair. They could be anywhere in the world who are particularly looking for a particular piece. And
so those calls, are they coming through red telephones and people are telling you, this is what I'd like?
Yes, they come through to the galleries themselves directly to saying, I'm ready for this. This is what I want. And thank you so much. Can I see it? Can I send someone to see it? Can I get an advisor to come and have a look at it if it's someone who's maybe here in South Africa and they cannot be there themselves? But collecting art is a passion for most. So you tend to find your chairmans and your CEOs or just individuals who are interested coming in themselves, to look at this work. The physicality part is still critical.
How important is it, though, to still have access to the likes of me who just like to look at art? Because you do know you don't have the deep pockets yet to get great collectibles from those major artists and big names.
Well, the reimagining of the fair with FNB 5 years ago shifted the focus to people like you now, to saying we need to find ways of growing the next cohort of South Africans who will carry this legacy forward, because the guys who started these type of things 18 years ago had now retired. If you look at the chairmen and CEOs of First Rand, a lot of them retired, as an example, and across different sectors. So it was quite important that we start to look to the future. But at the same time, we bring people who ordinarily would not be interested or didn't know how to engage with art. And lastly, it was so important that as transformation peaks in South Africa, we hope, across the private sector, that you can ultimately have the next cohort of leadership who are not blinded by what's on their walls in those offices or in government roles, because we wanted to find ways of protecting culture and of protecting the future of the art ecosystem. So very much the work that we do, when you walk into the fair, there's one side that's completely about education only, which is a talk program, the guided walkabouts, So it's a very warm, vibrant, exciting space that makes you feel proud to be South African.
That was Mandla Sibeko on How I Make My Money, the entrepreneur who redefined Johannesburg's art scene by turning FNB Art Joburg into a powerful black-owned platform for African contemporary art.
The best of the Money Show
on 702.
702.
In the recent edition of the Investment School feature, listeners were treated to a thought-provoking discussion with Patrick Mathidi, Head of Equities at Aluwani Capital Partners, and Gary Booysen, Director at Rand Swiss. Now, the conversation delved into the risks of what they termed the Rand roulette, a common tendency among South African investors to rush into buying US dollars during periods of Rand weakness. So we know how volatile the Rand is. Many then, as investors, tend to shelve their money elsewhere in the world. Is this a good idea? Let's find out.
These days, it is actually pretty easy to move funds offshore. So, of course, you have to obey the rules. So you've got up to your 1 million rand single discretionary allowance, and you can, of course, apply for the authorized international transfer, which is the AIT PIN, and that'll give you another 10 million. And that is a lot easier than has been in many years. So, we do these kinds of clearances for clients all the time. You need to prove the source of funds. You need to obviously have the documentation in place, or you need to declare 3 years assets and liabilities. But I think SARS reserves around 21 days to get that clearance sorted out, and we've seen them go through in probably 4 or 5 days at the moment. So definitely from an administration point of view, it's actually become quite easy to get them approved. And then it's just a matter of having an international account that can receive the funds, and it's about, I suppose, picking your time on when you want to pull the trigger on the currency and executing. So we do the whole process kind of end to end. So I find it very easy. I think from a client's point of view, maybe if you don't know how to set up an offshore account, or maybe, if you're not sure whether you should be doing this through a bank or a currency, what they call a treasury outsourcing client, so TOC, then it can maybe be a little bit tricky, but really the process is actually pretty simple.
What kind of client should be looking at this option? Because I'm thinking about the deep pockets that you might likely have to move your money offshore. But what kind of client asks you or requests this type of investing?
I don't think it's not really a matter of the value. And there's many services that can do very small amounts and still build an offshore portfolio for you and correctly
externalize. So you don't have to be
it.
well into the millions.
No, not at all. No. Like I said, it's actually much easier if you're under 1 million, because then you can use the single discretionary allowance. So it's really, like I said, I think the type of person that should be looking at this is, you should look at it in the context of your overall investment strategy and your overall portfolio. So I think it's always difficult to say when should you do it and who should do it. But really, if you have 100% of your money domestically and you work domestically and you're in South Africa, your house is in South Africa, everything to do with your wealth is in South Africa, for me then it makes sense to take a portion of your capital and move it offshore, because you can diversify. There's just investment options that just aren't available in the local market. You can access things like Tesla and exciting stocks. I think Intel is Intel I think is up 30% today. So you've got a much wider universe. But at the same time, if you live in South Africa, you are just incredibly pessimistic and you've moved 98% of your money offshore and you have no emergency funds in South Africa, you should probably start thinking about building up a reserve in South Africa as well, because it's something that you are going to adopt, that currency volatility. If the currency blows out, or like we have now with the South African Reserve Bank suddenly deciding that we're not getting an interest rate cut, and you see the currency strengthening, and suddenly you have an immediate call on your money. You need to buy a house, or you need to, you've got an emergency medical bill, but suddenly all of your assets are international. That's also not smart. Then I would say you probably need to be moving money back. So it really comes down to the client. I think all clients should have some element diversified, but there's no golden number on saying you should have 50-50 or that. It really comes down to the client situation.
Patrick, I'm quite the patriot when it comes to the South African Rand. I'm always rooting for it, even though it doesn't always turn out too good. But for somebody who's looking to move the Rand elsewhere in the world, what are those key markets where it's more successful to move our currency, giving its volatility and sometimes weakness against more stronger currencies?
Yeah, good evening, Motheo. Thanks for having me. I think it comes down to, the end objective. So what are you trying to achieve? And therefore, with that objective in mind, it kind of then leads you, to the best place where you feel that objective can be met, from an investment point of view as a start. But I think also, to your earlier question around the purposes and the type of clients, I think the other element that one should consider is, especially if one is a traveler, if you're lucky enough to be, traveling frequently offshore, whether for leisure or for business, it may be an idea to have, some foreign currency put aside, to try and smooth out the volatility. But to come back to your question, and I think it really comes down to what are you trying to achieve? And therefore, with that in mind, what's the best destination to kind of achieve that goal? And then the destination will then point to the currency. So, for example, if you're trying to invest and diversify, and then maybe you are not finding great opportunities, let's say out of the US market, because that is expensive, Nvidia, Tesla, whatever PEs there may be, but you're finding better opportunities, let's say in Asia, right? Then to access the Asian market, you may need to then convert your rand to yen. Given again, where you are finding those opportunities and how you can best access them. But ultimately, as I keep saying, where you want to be invested will dictate the currency in terms of how to be invested.
When we decide then as investors to move some of our currency elsewhere in the world, what kind of research are we doing before we even pull the trigger of moving the money and getting the forms ready? But what kind of research are we doing to make sure we also safeguard ourselves? I'm sure you can tell I'm quite conservative with moving money. Patrick?
So I think, again, the research that you need to do is, if you're diversifying purely for diversification purposes and away from, let's say, the local currency, the processes that was highlighted earlier, I think that is key in terms of the admin, just making sure that you've got the right setup and you are on good terms with the regulation. And then obviously on the other end, you need to make sure that you're investing in markets that are highly regulated, and therefore, and again, the propensity to lose your money, to scams and all that kind of stuff, gets eliminated. And then you need to look at the investable universe. So what are you trying to achieve? What opportunities you're looking for that are already available in South Africa? So, for example, if you're looking at investing in equities, but you do not want, commodities, you want, let's say, some thematic, type of products that is not readily available in SA, then you need to understand that, understand it properly, make sure that, you know what the drivers are, the return expectations, in local currency. And you need to have some sense of, over that investment horizon, what do you think the rand will do? Because a big chunk of your expected return profile, being a rand investor, is both the currency movement and the underlying investment in terms of, if you invested in yen, for example, what are the yen returns and what is that likely to do in rand terms, once you consolidate and bring in the currency into the equation. So all of that still points to understanding what you're investing in, what are the key drivers, what is the purpose of your investment? Is it to diversify? Is it to grow capital? Are you trying to shy away from inflation? Or is it purely a currency play where, again, you don't have to then go and buy equities or bonds, but you can actually sit, in cash. You can buy Swiss francs, for example, and just sit in that cash, and then that exchange rate against the rand, if you feel that, the rand will weaken, can be the main source of your returns going forward.
Then, Gary, let's get into what's allowed and what's not allowed when you're moving your money. Single discretionary allowance, foreign investment allowance. What are the differences there?
Yeah, so the single discretionary allowance that runs on the calendar year. So that's 1st of January to the 31st of December, and you can take out, essentially 1 million, and you can do it in tranches. And to your earlier question about how do you time this, how do you make the experience a little bit safer, you can, it's cumulative over the year. So following like almost a rand cost averaging strategy, if you're nervous that I'm going to buy this at the worst period and I'm going to lose money, you can do it in tranches. You can do 250, 250, 250, 100, 100, 100, whatever you want. But that allowance essentially runs for the calendar year, and then it'll reset again. So you have 1 million rand every calendar year to take out. With the AIT PIN, so that's your 10 million rand allowance, that is from the date of approval. So if you do obviously your application through SARS, and you get approved, let's say 18th of September, you will have until the 18th of September 2026 to move out your 10 million. And it can also be done in parts. It's really not an issue. Now, if you want to go above the 10 million, you can do special reserve bank approval. There are other mechanisms to transfer money out as well. So for example, now what we're seeing is there's also trust-to-trust distribution. So if you have a South African company that's held by a South African trust, for example, that trust can actually nominate an international trust as a beneficiary, and you'll be able to make a distribution internationally without limits. So there's lots of nuances to this as well. Another thing that I suppose listeners might not be aware of, that there's also a funds in, funds out rule. So if you have got an investment overseas, let's say you've taken $1 million rand out or 2 million rand out, and this year you have a call, you need to use the money in South Africa, and you bring 2 million rand back in, that actually that tops up your allowance. So now you actually can take 3 million out for this calendar year because you've brought money in. You can first kind of get that money out again, and then you can use your allowance. So it is, I think, more flexible than people maybe imagine. We kind of think of South African exchange controls and think, it's impossible to invest offshore. I might as well just go with a feeder fund locally. But there are real benefits to having that diversification. But again, it comes down to you as a person as well. It comes down to what you're trying to achieve with it. But yeah, I mean, it does get very nuanced. So exchange control is a very complex field. So everything from, where's the residency? Where did the funds come from? I mean, we've had people that have immigrated in like the 1980s that are now trying to repatriate money, but they didn't immigrate properly. So it can be quite complex. But nothing that, I mean, again, a quick consultation, kind of explaining the rules. I mean, I can't explain them all on radio.
That was Gary Booysen and Patrick Mathidi offering a sobering look at the risks of chasing currency movements and the importance of building a disciplined offshore investment strategy.
702. You are listening to The Money Show's best bits.
Well, you've been listening to the best bits of The Money Show, a digest of just some of the best interviews from the show this week. If you'd like to hear more, go to our website or your favorite podcast app and search for The Money Show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back on The Money Show, 6 p.m. on Monday. Have a good weekend.